Well, kia ora, and welcome to Danyl McLauchlan, a columnist for The Listener, and I think one of the most interesting deep thinkers about politics, political theory, how the real world works. Danyl, welcome on to the kaka.
Howdy, Bernard. Thanks for having me.
What did you think of Chris Hipkins's announcement yesterday that he was ruling out a wealth tax or a capital gains tax while he was leader? It was a bit of a sort of a repeat of Jacinda Ardern's, not in my political
Yeah.
lifetime. What did you reckon?
I mean, at first, my reaction was just one of the sort of standard cynicism that, it's a sort of continuation of Jacinda Ardern's decision. But Ardern was quite constrained at the time. She had New Zealand First as a coalition partner. Um, you could kind of see why she said that. And I think that Hipkins' situation is quite different. They have this majority. They haven't really done that much with it. They must kind of be thinking a little bit about that. And if they do lose the election, people ask this question: "What was your government for?" And they can kind of say COVID, but it's hard to say more than that. The wealth taxes are reasonably popular, like for 51% or 53% in a recent News Hub Read Research poll. And Treasury were kind of saying to them that the wheels are falling off the current tax system. You've been relying on this fiscal drag, letting inflation just kind of drift people's incomes up into higher and higher tax brackets. And now we're going into recession, and that's not really going to fly anymore. So we need to do something. So everything is kind of there. Everything is in place to announce this. And they didn't kind of say, we're not going to do it in the budget, we're not going to do it the election. He said, well, we're just never going to do that. We're never, ever going to do it, which seems really, I just don't quite understand it, to be honest. And I'm kind of curious if you have a theory of your own to explain what just happened.
Yeah, I think we've seen this before, and not just from the Labour Party, but also from National over the years. And we now have a pattern where politicians who have a set of options in front of them to reform things, and all of the options are uncomfortable, prefer, in a sometimes I think typically Kiwi way, just to shut the discussion down, not
Yeah.
to have the uncomfortable discussion. And one way to do that is if, things are tight and you want to just, get away from the pain, is to simply say, well, I'm never going to do that. I'm ruling it out. So there's no point in having a discussion about it, because in the real world of politics, even if you propose it in coalition negotiations, it is something I've already ruled out. So, don't even bother bringing it to the table. And therefore, journalists don't need to ask minor parties questions about it, because, well, it's never going to happen. And we've seen it, for example, on retirement issues with John Key doing it. And he also did it on, at least in the first term, on asset sales. And Labor have done it too, firstly with retirement issues, and now having gone to the dark side, I suppose, and talked about extending your retirement age, now also saying we'll rule it out for forever and ever. That's the impression I have. And it strikes me that it's completely in tune with the idea that a set of frameworks have been set up and they just can't be changed. They are forces of financial, legal, and structural nature that even politicians and voters just can't beat. So just give up now. You've done some really interesting writing about the administrative state, how politics can be captured. Could you give us a sense of how a government can be captured?
So I guess the thing, in terms of my writing about kind of captured state and managerial class, the thing that this reminded me of, this decision of Chris Hipkins, and there's kind of, he's slightly at odds with some of the other senior ministers in his government, Grant Robertson and David Parker, who wanted to do this, is it seemed really similar to Christopher Luxon's decision to sort of defect from that consensus on medium density housing. Um, and that's something that it's a solution to housing that his members of his caucus in the Liberal ring, Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis, had said, we want to get local government out of the housing market. We want to, as sort of a centre-right party should do, we want the market to solve all of these housing problems, and we want to stop having to pay a fortune in emergency housing and the accommodation supplement. And it's all completely consistent with what a centre-right Liberal Party would say. And then David Seymour and Christopher Luxon kind of decided, no, we're just not going to do that. We don't really have to sort of, deliver policy that is in line with any kind of value system or ideology. We're just really going to protect property owners and the value of their property, and sort of, use the state to do that. And that's really what we're there for. And so we kind of see something similar here with tax. David Parker and Grant Robertson could quite reasonably say, well, we're a left-wing party, we're the Labour Party. It's kind of ridiculous that we're taking more and more tax off Labour and none at all off capital. Like, that just seems at odds with everything we stand for. And so Christopher Hipkins has come along and kind of said, actually, we don't really stand for anything other than being in power, so we're just not going to, do that either. So it's kind of interesting to me that these ideological battles are happening within the parties rather than between the parties at this stage.
Yeah, because we're in a situation now under MMP where it's very difficult for one party, one political leader to enact a broad sweeping series of changes that are legislative, that are administrative, financial, structural, unlike under Muldoon or Longy and Douglas following them. New Zealand has this unusual, you could argue, constitutional situation where in combination with how caucus and cabinet works, basically, if you're in government pre-MMP, as Rob Muldoon showed us, if you had a strong leader who commanded the caucus and was appointing ministers to cabinet, no upper house, basically they could do everything. And one of the reactions to that post Muldoon was to create some legislative pseudo-constitutional frameworks. And I think here in particular of the Public Finance Act, the State Sector Act, the Reserve Bank Act, and the Resource Management Act, which all work together with these debt limits and using the RMA and also the local government reforms to make it virtually impossible to do any big projects. But also over time, as MMP kicked in, and it essentially weaponized the interests of people who have a lot at stake in society. They can organize themselves to back one of the winners or one of those players able to say no, to the point now we're in a sort of a vetocracy. And you see this overseas a lot, I think, as well, where whenever there's an attempt to change, defense sort of almost always wins. Could you talk a bit about this idea of a vetocracy and how our administrative class have see themselves in this process?
Yeah, so vetocracy is a term that's coined by Francis Fukuyama, the famous political scientist. It's in a series of books he wrote, 2 books on kind of the rise of political order. So it's not his really famous book. It's this his study of kind of how politics happens and what it looks like. And so he describes the sort of advanced liberal democracies of the 21st century as becoming vetocracies, which is that their systems are just so filled with kind of choke points and interested parties and interest groups that anyone at any point can kind of say, no, I want to block this or that from happening. And so nothing really happens. So you kind of start out trying to have quite a liberal society everyone has a voice, everyone has a seat at the table, and it ends up just with an overwhelmingly conservative outcome. The status quo is just completely entrenched because nobody can really do anything. So that's the Fukuyaman vetocracy. I mean, you can still kind of do some stuff in New Zealand. The last government built lots of roads, and they built the ultra fast broadband network. So if you kind of have, I think it sort of requires one of your top ministers, the PM, kind of has to say, I want you to do that, and you can't really do anything else. This, you just need to be sitting in meetings with officials screaming at them all day, every day for the next couple of years, and you can probably like push something through if you do that. But this government hasn't been that successful at kind of like it's done some big stuff. The health reforms are pretty huge, but they haven't been very successful, and so possibly because there hasn't been that level of attention to delivering what they want to deliver.
Yeah, I wonder about this theory of change in modern politics, that because of the way, in a way, defense is stronger than offense. And I think here in particular of how, and maybe this is my weakness for military history and watching too much YouTube of the First World and Second World Wars, where change in technology, the arrival of the machine gun and very powerful artillery, meant that almost immediately at the outbreak of the First World War, when military strategists thought it would be a war of movement, the application of machine guns and artillery forced everyone to dig trenches, and then you got stuck in this process of a stagnant stalemate. And I sense with tightening news cycles, with the ability to rapidly appeal to the interests of those who have assets and who have political power to say, hey, this is a change that will take something off you, you end up where the only change you can make in a place like that is to layer on top some sort of benefits for the middle class.
Yeah.
And I think if you look back at the big changes since MMP, they have typically been using taxpayers' money to provide a new benefit to middle or median voters. And I wonder if this new environment, particularly post-MMP, and the focus on appealing to median voters has led us down this track where it's actually really hard to take something off one group and give it to another. Or the only way you can make change is to give something to everyone, or at least those who are voting.
Yeah. So there's, I mean, that phenomenon you're talking about is loss aversion, that, something that comes up a lot in cognitive psychology, that people are really strongly motivated by the idea that they might lose something. And so it kind of messes up our sort of cost benefit calculations. I just finished reading the Zachary Carter biography of Keynes. And Keynes is kind of in the US, and he's helping the Roosevelt administration set up the Great Society, the New Deal. And Wall Street is very opposed because they have to pay more tax. And Keynes makes this point: you're going to be paying a little bit more tax, but look at how much debt we're raising, and we're going to be doing it all through you. You'll make orders of magnitude more money through that debt than you're going to pay in tax, and they don't really care. Someone is taking something from them. Their wealth is being stolen, and they don't make that sort of trade-off in their heads. And these are supposedly very smart people. So I agree. The same thing kind of happens. We have this vast system, very, very complicated system of rebates and subsidies and, independent earner credits that have kind of built up budget after budget. A lot of them don't really make any sense because they were designed by pollsters rather than Treasury officials to kind of win some demographic that the two parties are fighting over. So we don't really see, the average earner's salary going up that much over the last 40 years or so, but we do see, the amount of transfers going to low and medium income earners increasing quite dramatically.
And I'm curious too now, in this situation, what should voters, should they think, okay, we're now in an era where there's no point in debating big ideas or big changes or big solutions. All we're doing is electing a new manager
Yeah.
to manage the status quo. And the sort of person we're looking for is someone who comes out and says that they're all about the basics and the bread and butter, and they don't do vision. And they're here not to, waste time or money on trying to change anything. They're here just to manage the status quo in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah.
Um, how do you see that sort of spectrum between big change, big vision, big ideas, back down to, well, nothing can change anyway, so just appoint me and I'll make sure that you can turn the lights on every day?
I mean, the major parties are very unpopular at the moment. Like they're normally over the last 30 or so years, the combined Labour national vote is usually at about 80%. Sometimes it's even been higher than that. Most of the country was voting for either Labour or National, and right now it's kind of hovering at about 60%. That's quite low. You kind of have to go back to the mid 1990s when so many people just hated the two major parties because they didn't trust anything they said, and you saw the rise of New Zealand First and the Alliance and the ACT Party. And so we kind of seem to be going through a similar phase now. It's really, like you say, the two major parties are just these managerial centrist parties. Neither of them really have anything to offer in terms of a vision. So people are going to the other parties, and some of the visions are kind of radical and sometimes a little bit scary. But yeah, that's the decision that voters seem to be making in this election.
How do we break out of this? Because on the
Um,
face of it, even if you look at the election, the parties on either end of the spectrum, they may have quite transformative policies,
yeah,
good or bad.
mm,
But what we see in election campaigns is the party positions going up. And then the first thing the journalists do is go straight to the centrist parties
yes,
and say, which ones are you going to rule out?
yeah, yeah. I mean, something that I think is kind of interesting this time around is the Green Party, because I mean, their MPs will sit down at the table and negotiate, but it's the delegates who get to vote on whether or not the deal is made. And so, the MPs will kind of sit down with Labor, and Labor will say, well, we'll make you foreign minister, and we'll create all these new ministries and commissions for you. And if they take that back to the delegates, and the delegates say, well, we just don't care about those things, we care about a wealth tax, that kind of puts them in an interesting situation. It's sort of an oddly paradoxical thing where by making their MPs a little bit powerless, they enhance their power, maybe. I'm not sure if it's actually going to work out that way, but that's an interesting thing that might happen this time around.
Yeah, James Shaw said yesterday there was a possibility that if any deal was put to the delegates, they would say no, and that
Yeah,
the Greens would have to sit on the crossbenches. It's
yeah,
not clear to me exactly what sitting on the crossbenches means. A really purist, hardcore sitting on the crossbenches would mean no agreement on supply and confidence,
yeah,
and as well as no ministries and no
mm,
deals, if you like,
yeah,
with the remote threat that at any point
yeah,
a vote of confidence or a budget could fail because the Greens
mm,
refuse to let it through, which would lead to an election rather
yeah,
than the opposite as we currently see, and which is highly unlikely, which is the Greens doing a deal with National.
mm,
You're right, the delegates wouldn't accept that.
no,
But what it's meant, though, is that there is the prospect, if the delegates are still very grumpy, that they say no and force the Greens onto the
mm,
crossbenches, leading to, the potential hair trigger back to the voters again thing, which we haven't actually seen during the
no.
MMP, and a lot of people warned we were going to see.
Mm. I mean, I imagine that you would say we're going to support you on confidence and supply, or we're going to sit down at every budget and make a deal about supporting you, and everything else that you want to pass, that's just something that you negotiate with us, and you'll give us something. And like that would be an incredibly difficult way to govern, especially if you're having to do it with the Greens and Te Pāti Māori at the same
Mm.
time. I mean, that would just be really hard work. And I can't quite imagine what that government would look like. And I suspect Labour would do just about anything to avoid being in that position, because you just need to pass so much legislation just on a day-to-day basis to keep the country running. And if you're having to sit down and hammer something out and give something away every single time, that yeah, that would just be really difficult.
And one of the things I'm really interested in your writing about
Yeah.
the administrative state
Mm.
and the captured state is that this lack of apparent power of politicians or voters to um, uh, enact any change or get any, substantial power to do any change
Mm.
means that if you're in the administration and you're a public servant or some sort of long-term advisor, you're able to say, yep, good idea, like the idea of the
Yeah.
change, but let me do a study on that. And in brackets, and I'm not, this is the thing I'm not telling you, I'm just going to wait until something else changes or the minister gets kicked out or there's a change of government, and I can just flannel my way to not having to change because I quite like the current situation.
Yeah, I mean, there was a sort of micro scandal a few months ago when the DIA officials were just rewriting the
Yeah.
laws on
Mm,
the Three Waters proposal, just kind of changing it and not really just doing that. And I mean, that's not how our democracy is supposed to work at all. That's it's supposed to be, the MPs sit between that process, and we don't really have a democracy if that doesn't happen. But yeah, I mean, they do seem to have tremendous power and influence, especially over spending and procurement. The types of things that this government, especially, is spending money on, I think, like frustrates the government itself. They kind of don't know why um, they're allocating money for mental health, for example, and it's just not going anywhere or doing
mm.
anything. And the Infrastructure Commission came out with a report recently into why that was, and they said it was because the officials, driving that just didn't really know what they were doing, so they just kind of wasted lots of money and didn't deliver anything, which is amazing. It's an amazing challenge to the left, because if you kind of think, well, we need state capacity and we just need to tax the wealthy more, and you know that will kind of overcome neoliberal austerity and we'll be living in a better society. The idea that you could do all of that and just still not be delivering anything to the public because the officials in charge of it don't know what they're doing is, it's quite a big challenge to that project.
So just finally, for our listeners who want to try and improve things and want
Mm,
to see a contest of ideas and to vote on something that actually improves things, what would you say to them? Because we're heading into an election campaign where it seems like all the options are being ruled out before before the starting
yeah.
gun has even gone out, and also because of that, political journalists and the media coverage is less focused on the issues because we can't talk about those,
Mm,
and much more focused on the contest, the horse race.
yeah. I mean, I think we're getting reasonably good coverage of the issues. I think. I mean, we've had quite comprehensive coverage of the tax, the capital gains decision. I mean, I don't know who people should vote for. I do kind of think that the sentiment that the major parties aren't the solution to anything is quite a solid one, and that you should look at an alternative there. But yeah, I kind of don't think it's my job to tell people who they should vote for. I mean, I make donations to effective charities, and I kind of think that's the way that I affect positive change in the world. I don't really think
Mm.
that voting in the New Zealand political system has a really dramatic influence on the amount of good in the world. So I think you should try and find an alternative way to do that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Quite a few politicians have sort of left politics and gone back to grassroots organising and NGOs to try to achieve change, having sort of given up on working within the system.
The
But we'll see
the
how that goes.
the there's a book that I was thinking about in the last couple of days with this Labour announcement. Alan Clark, who was a defence minister under Thatcher, and he wrote these incredible diaries that he published after he left politics. And towards the end of them, of his time in power, he kind of realizes that he hasn't really done anything. Like his policies didn't get through. They were sort of defeated by his enemies in his own caucus. And he says, all that work and all that sacrifice, and I have nothing to show for it but the passing of time and the intrusion of age. And I sort of wondered, is that how, are some Labour politicians having the same thought? Like, if it does make you wonder, if you're young and thinking of going into politics, you're not going to be as charismatic as Jacinda Ardern. You're not going to be as clever as David Parker or Grant Robertson, and they kind of haven't really delivered the change I think they would have liked to when they were going into that. And it does, it does make you wonder if that is the way to make change.
Yeah. Fascinating. Danyl McLauchlan, thank you so much for being on the Kaka, and I'd recommend our readers subscribe and support Danyl's work through the listener or wherever he turns up. And I really appreciate your time, Danyl. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks, Bernard.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Right. So